why can't those individuals marry each other? I mean, is the church bigoted against gays? Does the church hate them? Is the church homophobic? I mean, seriously, like, what about marriage equality? I mean, doesn't love equal love? Let's break these down because they deserve a valid response. Well, for one, love equals love. This is called a tautology. It just basically in linguistics, it means nothing. You're not defining love, so you can't further clarify it by simply repeating the word. So that doesn't get us very far. Is the church homophobic? Well, personally, I don't like the word homophobic just because I think it's very important that words have clear meanings. If you are afraid of enclosed spaces, you are a claustrophobic. If you have an inordinate fear of open spaces, you are agoraphobic, coming from the word field. It's just too big. I'm kind of afraid. If you're afraid of spiders, arachnophobic. Okay. Well, what if I just hate spiders? And if I'm not afraid of them, but if I see any in my house, I'm just going to kill the things. Am I arachnophobic? No, I'm not. So I can basically hate them and kill everyone I see, but I'm still not arachnophobic. Yet if I believe that marriage means X, Y, and Z, yet I care about and love individuals who experience these attractions, I become a homophobic. I think if we're calling each other names, it means we've either run out of charity or we've run out of good arguments or we have run out of both. I would say, let's drop the name calling. Does homophobia exist in terms of hatred and unjust discrimination and bigotry? It does. But I think it needs to be called for what it is, such as hatred, instead of throwing names at each other. Well, what about marriage equality? I'm going a little limb on this one, but I would say nobody watching this or listening to this actually believes in marriage equality. I can't say that I've actually met anybody who believes in marriage equality. And some people, oh, that's ridiculous. I believe in marriage equality. And I say, okay, well, look, marriage equality, it's a catchy slogan. You can put a hashtag on it. It doesn't eat up too many characters. You can use it as a bumper sticker. But slogans are not a substitute for sound arguments. And here's why. If you were to say, well, you're in favor of marriage equality, I could test that. And I said, okay, well, let's see if you truly are, because I wish to marry two women, okay? And for whatever reason on earth, they both actually want to marry me. And we want to enter into a three-way polygamous or some way polyamorous relationship. Are you in favor of marriage equality for us? And most people would say, well, no. You got Jason, you got to kind of make up your mind here. Just like pick one and marry that one. And I would say, well, wait a minute. Are you seriously going to legislate against my private romantic relationship as if what we do in the confines and the privacy of our own home is going to just destroy the institution of marriage? I mean, seriously, if you say that two women or two men can do just as good a job of raising kids as a man and a woman, then how come a man plus two women can't do an even better job? I mean, are you really going to tell me that like there's something so magical about the number two that you can have love as a couple, but we can't have love as a throuple? I mean, you could see throwing all these arguments at you. I'm just trying to like essentially emotionally bully you into a place where you're just going to cave on your definition of marriage. But I would say, okay, I'll concede the point that I have to pick one of these two ladies. And so I pick this one, but we would like to have an open marriage where instead of it being monogamous, it'll be kind of monogamish, where we're open mutually to the idea of having other sexual partners in order to kind of keep the flame alive in our relationship. And we're both okay with this. Would you be in favor of marriage equality for an open marriage? Most people would say no. Not only do you have to pick only one spouse, but it needs to be mutually exclusive. Fidelity is an essential element of marriage. Okay, well, fine. We'll be faithful to each other, but instead of entering into wedlock, where it's permanent, we'd rather have something that's more like wed lease. Okay, so instead of a marriage license that lasts forever till death do you part, we'd prefer maybe a 10-year contract. And after the first term of 10 years, things are still going smoothly, we'll renew the commitment and head in for another 10. And if it's not, well, we just won't renew and no hard feelings. Are you in favor of that? People would again say, well, no, that's not marriage. It needs to be between two people, monogamous, mutually exclusive, permanent. And I say, okay, fine. Okay, we'll have it be permanent and it can't be with more than one person. Well, what about the people out there that actually want to marry themselves? You can see this on the internet. People are actually doing this. I read an article of one woman where she said, look, if I don't find a good enough husband by the time I turn 40, I'm going to marry myself. And that's indeed what she did. She had a wedding type of ceremony and reception and presents. I don't know what would happen if they had to get a separation, how exactly that would work. But are you in favor of marriage equality for her? And some people say, now you're just getting absurd, right? Okay, it has to be between two people, mutually exclusive, all that jazz. And I'll say, okay, just one more scenario. Let's say I'm married, which I am, but my wife and I don't know, it's been a long time, 17 years, getting on each other's nerves a little bit. And, we just think we just would rather go separate ways. We'd just be happier, maybe in a different marriage. Are you in favor of marriage equality if I can just divorce her and marry somebody else? And she can as well. Well, Jesus said that if we do that, we're actually committing adultery. Well, are you not in favor of marriage equality for us with a second spouse? Now, with all of these different scenarios that I've presented of these individuals, polyamory and all this stuff, do you hate those people? Well, if you don't hate them, then why are you bigoted against them? Well, why won't you let them marry? Well, what you would probably say is, well, look, they're all free to marry, but none of them actually want to enter into what is a marriage. It's not about, may they get married as if it's a question of permission. It's can they marry? What is marriage? Because it's not about equality and fairness and bigotry. It's about this $1 million question. What is marriage? Now, historically, marriage has existed as an institution to legally bind a father to his offspring. It's not a very romantic notion, but historically, that's why it exists. Because a woman, when a child comes into the world, doesn't really have that much of an option not to be present at the day of that delivery. She can't really opt out. I'm not really feeling up to it today. She's kind of got to be there. Yet the man, on the other hand, unfortunately, can bail out and be a deadbeat dad. And so what marriage as an institution historically has been of a way of ensuring that that father is present in the upbringing of his children, which has enormous benefits for the entire society. You've probably seen the studies of fatherless families and how they basically, the boys fill up the prisons and the girls end up with strollers. And, when they're 15 years old, it just doesn't typically go well. And so historically, that's been the secular reason for it. But when the church is speaking about marriage, it's not primarily talking about what two people do. They exchange vows and live together and love each other. The church is primarily speaking about what two people become, which is a visible image of Jesus Christ's love for his bride, the church. That Jesus left his Father in heaven and his mother on earth to give his body to his bride, the church, so that we might have his life within us. And what a husband and a wife do is they make visible the very invisible love of God. That is a communion of life-giving love between two persons. And so marriage, the Catholic Church would say, is not consummated by two people doing something sexual, but rather by the two becoming one flesh. Because if you were to think about it, if a husband and a wife engaged in the same physical act that two women could engage in physically, the church would say that that marriage has not been consummated, and so it is not indissoluble. Likewise, if man and a woman engage in the sexual acts that only two men would engage in, the church would again say that they have not become one flesh. They have not consummated the marriage. Now, this is not hate speech, and I can understand how it would feel like, well, isn't the church kind of singling out same-sex couples? But no, the same laws would apply in terms of the physical manifestation of the sacrament. Where when the marriage, you're saying, I give myself completely to you. I am all yours. Will you be faithful to each other? Yes. Will you welcome children into your marriage? Yes. And so these promises that your love is free, total, faithful, and ordered towards procreation, you stop with the words at the church, you finish those, but then you go on to your wedding night and you speak the wedding vows in and through the bodies. And since the bodies of same-sex couples are incapable of speaking the vows of a total gift of self, the church would say they cannot consummate the vows that might be spoken out loud. And the same thing would actually apply to an opposite-sex couple. If they were to engage in contraception through all their acts of intercourse, like, we don't want to have kids, we don't want to give ourselves fully in that way, the church would say that that is not even a valid marriage. Likewise, if a person was suffering from impotence, now, to define our terms, infertility is when a person is struggling to become pregnant. Sterility is when they can have intercourse, but they're not going to become pregnant. Then there's another thing called impotence. Impotence is when you are incapable of the sexual act. And the Catholic Church would actually say that if you are incapable of the one flesh union, that you are incapable of marriage itself. And people would say, well, come on, man. I mean, there's more to marriage than, heterosexual intercourse, right? Well, where's this coming from? Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew actually alludes to this. He talks about eunuchs who were servants to the queen. Now, a eunuch was a person who was basically castrated and impotent, and therefore would have no threat against the chastity of the queen, and so they would serve the queen in a close way. And these were eunuchs. And Jesus mentions these eunuchs as being incapable of marriage. Now, why would a eunuch be incapable of marriage? It's because by their nature, they're incapable of the one flesh union. Now, this is all obviously, I think, a lot harder for the culture today to understand, because the culture that first separated sex from marriage is now wanting to separate marriage from sex. It first demanded to be able to have sex without marriage, and now it's demanding to actually have marriage without sex. And the fruit of this is that for the first time in human civilization, we are deliberately engineering motherless and fatherless children. And this will not go well. And people will say, well, no. The studies are in. 2 men, 2 women can do an equally good job of raising kids. Well, data is hardly that clear at all. In fact, it actually shows the opposite. For decades and decades, long before same-sex marriage was ever really on the radar culturally, we had thousands of pages of sociological evidence showing that children, when raised by their biological mother and father, typically do better on a whole range of health outcomes, mentally, physically, than they would if they were in any other arrangement, whether it be foster parenting, adoptive parenting, step parenting, blended families, you name it. Biological mother and father had the best benefit over all of them by a landslide. But yet what was interesting is once same-sex marriage became culturally an issue, these people are saying, oh no, well, it really doesn't make a difference. They do, 2 men, 2 women do just as good of a job as the biological mom and dad. Now, to me, this is astounding that essentially what you're saying is that 2 men or 2 women can do the same, just as good of a job, but yet all these other arrangements, heterosexual adoptive parenting, step parenting, foster parenting, all of those are a notch below. It's overturning literally decades of research. And so, now I'm not saying, and please understand me, I'm not saying that, a same-sex couple doesn't love their kid. I wouldn't say that. In fact, some people might get upset at me, but I'm sure they're changing diapers like I am at 2:00 in the morning. They're cheering for their kid in his school play. They're helping them with their math tests. They're, taking their temperature, and, they love that kid in many ways. They make 1,000 sacrifices, God willing, for that child. I'm not saying that there's no love present there, but I would say that parenthood is more than just what you do for a kid. Parenthood ultimately is about who you are. And so what I mean by that is a mother's love is irreplaceable. The love of a father is irreplaceable. Ask anyone who's had a good dad and lost him because of an untimely death, or maybe he just was never around to begin with. There's an ache there for something that should have been filled. And you can't just plug in the same gender and say, oh, it's pretty much the same thing. I'm telling you, I'm sorry, but a man could not replace my wife as the mother of our children. I'm telling you, an army of 1,000 men could not replace my wife as the mother of my children. Not just on an emotional level, but on a deeply biological level. If I were to have you just close your eyes, use your imagination, imagine a husband and wife in bed together with a newborn baby little girl. I mean, let's say she's 3-4 months old. That little girl is between them, breastfeeding at the mother, and the father's arms around the 2 of them. Take that image, just put that in your mind, sit on that. Now I want you to imagine a 3-month or 6-month-old girl in bed between 2 men. There is a difference here. And if you would say, no, love is love. Scientifically, biologically, there's a huge difference here. And part of that you could see in the chemical composition of breast milk. If you've ever studied this stuff, it's fascinating. In fact, I read an article a while ago that was explaining that when a child breastfeeds, the baby will actually backwash a little bit of saliva into the mother's breast. And her immune system will immediately recognize if that child has a bacterial infection, virus, whatever, and it will immediately create an immunological response, pumping literally billions of white blood cells into the breast milk to be gulped down by the baby per day. Billions of white blood cells. It'll actually transfer the immunological memory of the mother where if she's tangled with those bacteria before in her life and overcome them, it'll transfer that immunological memory into the child to help it to battle those pathogens. And it'll actually concoct a tailor-made pharmaceutical recipe for the well-being of that child. If you were to breastfeed or breast pump from a mother when her baby is sick versus healthy, the breast milk will visibly look different. You don't have to put it under a microscope. When the baby's sick, the breast milk looks very similar to colostrum. Colostrum is the breast milk that the mother produces the first couple of days after the delivery of the baby. They are loaded with white blood cells to establish the baby's immune system in this new world with all these different pathogens. Now, when the baby becomes well again, the woman's breast tissue will detect that. And the breast milk will change back to its normal chemical composition, and it'll look normal as well. And one of the articles I was reading on this said, yeah, ladies, so if anyone ever shames you for breastfeeding in public, you just tell them you are performing a diagnostic test. So to me, it is beautiful the way that God has created our bodies to work in a complementary way. And if a child cannot even come into the world except through the union of the sperm of a man and the egg of a woman, it might be an indication that emotionally, that's what the kid is going to need in his life as well. And I know that this could create a cross of like, well, wait a minute, no kids, not for me, never. I mean, but I want to be a father. In fact, I had read in a journal of orthopsychiatry where a couple of guys adopted this little baby boy. And, and they raised him up. And I guess when he was like 3 or 4 years old, they'd have to go to work. And so they'd hire a nanny to help take care of the little kid. And he just kept getting so clingy and attached to these female nannies, they had to kind of fire him. It was just getting way too much. And it came to the point when the kid was like 4 or 5 years old, he started to ask the two dads, can I buy a mom? Can we buy a mom? How much would it cost? Could we just save it up to get a mom? And what's heartbreaking here is that the adult perceived right to possess a child is superseding the child's own right to his biological mother and father. And some people will say, well, isn't it better that they at least have two dads than be shifting around the foster home community and, be stuck in that kind of life? Well, first off, let's be fair to the foster care system. Yeah, sure, there's some problems there, but there are some tremendously wonderful foster care parents. And this idea that they're all just a bunch of drug addicts, sexually abusive, checked out parents is just not true. In fact, a friend of mine, he and his wife got married hoping to have a huge family. And they couldn't, struggled with infertility for years and years. And so they said, well, maybe God's calling us to adopt. And they said, well, let's start with foster parenting. And they became foster parents to more than 50 children. Now, not all at once, obviously, but with a foster kid, when you take him in, you could have him for a week, you could have him for a day, you could have him for a lifetime. You're just not quite sure. So it's an incredible ministry to be able to embrace and let go like that. And so over the course of many years, they ended up taking like 50 foster kids and just loving them and raising them well. And then they said, let's take a little break. It was funny. As soon as they took a break, they got pregnant right away. And then another pregnancy, another one. And they ended up having their own big family eventually. But so the foster care system, it's a beautiful thing. It's not intrinsically messed up, but it's obviously not the ideal, right? Because each one of those kids, if they had their way, would have a functional, loving, biological mother and father. And so we shouldn't look to something that's less than ideal as the model for how we should build relationships and what we should do for parenting. The model should not be foster parenting or blended families. The model should be the intact family. And we should do everything in our power to help kids to have this. Now, for those who hear this, though, I could understand that by virtue of being a man, you're called to fatherhood. In virtue of being a woman, you are called to motherhood. But this calling is not always fulfilled in simply a biological way. It could be fulfilled in spiritual motherhood and emotional in many different ways. Because look, I can't promise, in the end where the attractions are going to go. A friend of mine, he'd experienced same-sex attractions, and he's like, I'm not going to listen to the church because I want to be a dad. And if I listen to the church, then I'm never going to be able to be a dad. So forget the church. And he lived that lifestyle or whatever. And then eventually said, I think I need to just start trusting God with my desires, trusting him with my body, trusting him with my heart. And he started just one day at a time, just kind of practicing chastity. And he said it was the weirdest thing. He said this girl in my young adult community recently, I just felt this like spark of attraction to her. I don't know where the heck that came from. He even said to me, he's like, I wasn't trying to pray the gay away. He said, I just felt this. I didn't know where it came from. And eventually they went on a date together and something. But the fact is, the goal is not just to change your attractions. That if we can just change your attractions, then you're going to be really holy. This psychologically is so impairing. because it sends this message that as long as you have those desires, you're not really progressing that close to Jesus. And so it's been another month. You still have them. You're still far from God. The attractions are not under the faculty of the will. You can't just flip them on and off like a light switch. Granted, we can reinforce them by how we behave and what we look at, but your holiness is not measured by your capacity to change your sexual attractions. Your holiness, I think, is ultimately measured by your willingness to conform your heart to God's heart. That God, I will trust you even though my future is dark, even though it's uncertain. I believe in the Father's love for me. And if we don't believe in him, then there's really, how do we make any progress? Like, do we have a good Father? Does he actually love us as his sons and daughters? That's what it all comes down to. Trust is the key that unlocks the limitless blessings he wants to pour upon us. But if we don't trust him, we can't receive. Now, all of this, chastity, this is difficult, right? I mean, Jesus Christ told us that if any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Because at the end of the day, Christianity cannot be emptied of the cross. And suffering to me is when your will does not equal up to God's will. And so at those times, I think that we're tempted to distrust the Father. I think what we always tend to do is want to grasp. I remember reading one woman who experienced same-sex attractions, and here's what she said. She said, it's really just learning to trust that God knows what's best for your life and letting go of your own notions that you know what's best. And so I think what he's inviting us to, God is inviting us to come to him, all of us, in prayer with all our hopes, all our urges, all our desires, all our wounds, all our fears, anxieties of the future, regrets of the past, and just bring them to him. Mother Teresa wrote a prayer for her Missionaries of Charity, and in it she says this, Jesus loves you always, even when you don't feel worthy. When not accepted by others, even by yourself sometimes, he's the one who always accepts you. Only believe you are precious to him. Bring all of your suffering to his feet. Only open your heart to be loved by him as you are. He will do the rest. And so I think what God wants to do for us in prayer is gently distinguish from us those things that we've identified ourselves by that aren't truly the core of who we are. And sometimes we do this with our vices. Oh, I'm the alcoholic. I'm the porn addict. I'm this, I'm that. No, you're more than your vices. Sometimes we do it with our virtues. Oh, I'm the, this person and I excel in this virtue and I go to church this many times. Pharisaical kind of stuff. No, your identity isn't your good or your bad. But you look at somebody, professional athletes or like rich people or people in power, like what if LeBron James couldn't shoot a basketball starting tomorrow? Like what if he suffered some life-threatening injury or paralysis, neck down? Would he know who he is? I tend to think he is. Seems like a good husband, good father. But what if you had a person in a position of power, Donald Trump? What if he lost all his wealth and all his power? Would he know at the end of the day, who he is as a son of God? Obviously, I don't know him well enough to judge that question, but what if it's all stripped away? All the power, all the wealth, all the reputation, all the sins, all the vices, all the virtues, the attractions, same sex, whatever. What at the end of the day, when it's all stripped away, what's at the very inner core is our sonship being loved by the Father. And so I think just as a prideful person tries to identify him by his good works, I think those of us who may think we're far from God will try to identify ourselves naturally with the things that we mess up with. But I remember a priest, and I think he kind of said it best. He said, look, the devil and God, the devil knows your name, okay? But he calls you by your sins. God knows your sins, but he calls you by your name. And so your name is that you're loved. And I think it's not about the church being anti-honesty, trying to be dishonest about your attractions, but rather in discovering this deep peace that comes in finding our identity in Jesus Christ. And honestly, I absolutely look forward to the day in the Catholic Church when we have saints who are canonized saints who experienced homosexual attractions. You know what? We may already have saints canonized who experience same-sex attractions, but maybe at their time of the church and the history, it wasn't something that they could talk about, but it was an attraction they had experienced, but they chose to glorify God in and through their bodies. But I look forward to the day when raised to the altar in the church, we will have people who expressly share how they experienced same-sex attractions and yet trusted God in and through their bodies. Is this unrealistic? No way. What I think is unrealistic is expecting people to believe that they will find fulfillment living outside of the will of God.